Jesmyn Ward has been praised as a standout writer of her generation. Her works are influenced by the social and economic conditions of a life lived along the Mississippi Gulf Coast and the triumphs and heartbreak she has experienced. The first woman and first person of color to win 2 National Book Awards for fiction, Jesmyn is a MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant recipient and teaches creative writing as a professor at Tulane University in New Orleans. I recently sat down with Jesmyn to discuss the restorative power of her work and the need to develop community, personal and artistic, in order to grow and succeed in the writing world. I remember reading in your memoir how you felt a little awkward talking to people that you grew up with about the possibility of becoming a well-known author. And here you are now, this literary giant described by American booksellers as the new Toni Morrison, putting local experiences and stories out into the universe for the world to hear. And I was just curious about how you and your community are embracing this kind of celebrity or public figure status, and how are you handling actually being compared to Toni Morrison?
Whenever someone makes that comparison, I feel like I always, recoil a little because because I grew up reading her work and I think idolizing not only the writing that she produced, but also the sort of the way that she lived her life. I don't know everything about her, but it seems like she was very invested in community and nurturing other writers around her, and sort of nurturing them to bring about great work, in addition to producing her own work. So, she's just, there's no one like her. And so I think that's, it is a great compliment, and I recognize it as a great compliment, but I don't know, I feel like she's still on such a pedestal in my head that sometimes, all the time really, it's a little hard for me to accept the compliment. I don't know, I feel like the people in my family and people in my community, they're very proud of me and of what I've done, and and the fact that that I'm writing specifically about the place that they are from too. And I think that a lot of them, they enjoy recognizing them, seeing them, people like them, them like them on the page. And also, I know for people who are from here but who have moved away, it's a different experience sort of reading my work for them, because it makes them feel like they've come back home, right? And so there's a different, I guess, enjoyment or connection that they get out of reading my work. And then too, people are, I feel like people don't usually talk about this, but people here are protective of me, in a way, right? And I guess just because we come from such a small place where everyone knows everyone and everyone has known everyone for so long, I don't know, I feel like people are protective too at the same time that they're proud.
Yeah, good. That community definitely is special. And you mentioned kind of recoiling when people make the Toni Morrison comparison. Do you have any particular mentors or people who are kind of helping you on this journey?
So many of the people in the publishing industry that I've worked with, many of them are older than me. Many of them have been very important to me, in helping me navigate this journey and navigate the publishing world, because when I started out, I knew next to nothing about it, right? And then when I began, I started out in the early 2000s, right? And the landscape for Black literary writers back then was very different, I feel like, than the landscape for Black literary writers now. And so I think that I needed that help from them even more. So like in specific terms, like I'm talking about my editor, Kathy Belden, I'm talking about my speaking agency that I work with, Lyceum Agency, like they've been sort of instrumental in helping me to figure out like how to navigate my career. My literary agent, Rob McQuilkin. I mean, as far as writers are concerned, I don't know. I love KSA Lehman, right? And so whenever I can be out in the world with him and commune with him and connect with him, like that's always a good thing, because I feel like it makes me feel sort of less alone in this endeavor. Because I think it's different for writers like me who live much of their lives outside of New York City. You know what I'm saying? Like it's different. Like I live in my little hometown where most people don't know who I am, or most people who are strangers to me, right? Like don't know who I am. And that's just a very different existence, I think. And so, so I love like being in fellowship with him. Like Mitchell Jackson, he's very much like plugged into the sort of the writing scene around New York City, but like he's another writer who I am always overjoyed to spend time with, because again, like I feel like he is, I don't know, like he always has an interesting perspective, on this industry, and I like, communing with him. I think it was last year, there was the Phyllis Wheatley, the festival, right? And there I met Patricia Smith, the poet. I think I have her name right, and then also Eredy, what is her? D. Matthews, I think is her last name. She's also a poet, and that was very special to me because I don't know. One, because I love poets, and two, because I think that I don't know. Like I think that again, like that's one of the things that I admire the most about the way Toni Morrison lives her life, because she was always in fellowship with other writers, and so I feel like I've been trying to make more of an effort, because I exist outside, of New York City, because at least on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, like I'm not plugged into a local, sort of community of artists. So I've been trying to sort of reach out to other, poets, novelists, artists, and I don't know, to try to create more of a sense of, I think, community and artistic community, I think, in fellowship. But those are just some of them. I don't know.
I'm glad that you mentioned the Phyllis Wheatley Poetry Festival. Actually, I was going to ask a question about that. That's, of course, the first time that we met, but also we got to hear from awesome speakers, of course, Alice Walker being one of them. And I was just curious, what, of course, you mentioned that you developed community with some of the poets, but what did that experience mean to you?
I had never experienced anything like that before. And I think that experience of being at that festival with so many amazing Black women, who are artists, I think that in part is what made me begin to think about what it would mean to sort of have more fellowship, with specifically like Black artists in my life. Because I think it's difficult work that we all engage in, right? And so I think that it's worthwhile to be part of, of a community, because in that space there was just so much, like, I don't know, there was so much calm, there was joy, there was like deep respect, there was, acceptance. There was such a celebration of our genius. Like I just I had never been in a physical space where we were centered, where all of that was centered. So I don't know, I feel like it's difficult for me to talk about and to articulate because it felt almost spiritual. Yeah, definitely. So it's sort of hard to talk about intellectually because I didn't, yes, it meant a lot to me mentally, but it really moved me emotionally and spiritually so much. So I don't know. So it's just hard to articulate.
No, I definitely get it. I agree. It was very powerful. Of course, we talked about doing this difficult work, but we were also able to just fellowship and let our hair down. I told people I actually did the electric slide with Alice Walker. Oh my goodness. So yes, definitely I agree. Speaking of kind of electric slide, music and spirituality. So in a 2016 interview with Danielle K. Taylor, she actually dubbed you the literary voice of the Dirty South. And I know that you all talked a little bit about musical influences, and of course in your first few novels you have epigraphs with hip-hop lyrics. So I was just curious if your taste for music and hip-hop has changed since you all talked about that. Are there any particular artists that you are interested in or just jam out to, or maybe that you think kind of speak a similar message that you try to convey?
Yeah, I don't know. Before I answer that part of the question, I have to include someone else in my answer to your previous question about people who I look to, and who I seek fellowship with, because I have to mention this person because I feel like my interactions with her and my friendship with her is really one of the sort of major motivating factors for me to begin to think about how we can help each other in this work, how we can show up for each other in the work we do. Is Regina Bradley. Right? And she's, she's, because I think that she's one of the first, and we sort of came into contact with each other sort of years ago. And we've only been in each other's physical presence a couple of times, but still she the care with which she sort of reaches out to other people, she's very purposeful about, pulling people into community, right? About advocating for, for other writers, right? Both in the classroom and just out in, the world of publishing. She's, she's fantastic. And I apologize for not thinking of her when I answered the first question. But this question that you just asked about music actually made me think of her because a lot of her scholarship is around Southern hip hop and also sort of Black literature. I mean, I still listen to hip hop, but I'm sort of sliding into middle age at this point in my life. Lately I haven't been listening to music as much. When my kids get in the car, I just sort of let them listen to whatever they want to listen to. So, I don't know, we've been listening to a lot of Glorilla in the past. A weird mix of Glorilla and Billie Eilish. I don't know what's going on in my car. But I don't know. But I've been listening to a lot of sort of podcasts, I think, more so. I don't know. I think maybe because these days I feel hungry for information in a different way. And I've tried to listen to audiobooks while I'm driving, but for whatever weird reason, I get tired. Like listening to an audio, like something that's like long form narrative makes me tired. But as far as like podcasts, it's easier for me to listen to them. So I'm sorry, I feel like that's a disappointing answer, but I still love, like I still love hip hop. I still love, soul music and R&B. It's just, I'm in this weird place in my life, where I feel like I feel like music does help us navigate what we're going through, but I feel like perhaps at this point in my life, I feel like I need more information than music in order to navigate the world that we're living in now. No, so maybe that's it.
I completely get that. And when you were describing the person that you forgot, I kind of knew and was hoping that you would mention Regina Bradley. I always think about, of course, people are always comparing you to Faulkner. She's like, no,
right,
no, that is wrong.
Right.
She is the Jesmyn Ward. She is not Faulkner. So yes. Perhaps my favorite novel of yours, although I have to say it's becoming more increasingly difficult to choose a favorite, but Salvage the Bones has always had a place in my heart, but it has been the subject of book bans and challenges, but people of course have defended it as well. And I know that in your conversation with LeVar Burton at the Mississippi Book Festival, you talked a little bit about book bans. I was just wondering if you could share a little bit more about what it means to have your books potentially be banned from schools or libraries.
Yeah, I mean one of my friends who works in publishing, he's an editor, his name is Yadan Israel. And so we went to like a random dinner one time, and one thing that we were talking about, like book bans, and he said something like that he felt like, he was like, think about back in the day when rock and roll came about, right? And there was this big push, of course, right, to sort of, to censor sort of rock and roll, to keep it away from the kids. It was a bad influence, et cetera, et cetera. He's like, and then what happened? That effort to ban that artistic expression meant that it brought people to it. So he said that he thinks that is what will ultimately happen with books. And I hope so, like I hope that's the case. Because it just, this effort, and there are a lot of, people and organizations who, who do these challenges and who push to ban books. Like it makes me very angry, and sorrowful, because I feel like just because you ban a book, say you ban Salvage the Bones, which is about a 15-year-old sort of pregnant girl, right? That doesn't mean that you're banning the reality, right? That doesn't mean that there's not some 15-year-old, pregnant kid in rural New Mexico, or in, or in rural Illinois, or in, rural Alabama, right? Or in Florida, right? Who is bewildered and trying to figure out how to navigate the world, right? In the position that they're in. And, if they had access to a book like Salvage the Bones, maybe it could help them sort of figure out how to live through something like that, right? And so it just, I don't know, it makes me very angry, because I feel like kids, often they find their way to the books that they need, like they seek out the books that they need. And they, even if they can't articulate it to themselves, right? Like there's something if they, read a book, there's something in that book that speaks to them, right? And that is helping them understand something either about the world or about themselves. And I don't know, I feel like that kind of work is always a good thing. So it just makes me really angry, because I feel like the reality of like the people that I write about, there are kids all over, the United States who are, dealing with teen pregnancy or living with abusive caregivers or neglectful caregivers or, living with caregivers who are, struggling with substance addiction, right? So I don't know. So it makes me angry that kids aren't able to find what they need in books, in places where books are read.
Yep. I read somewhere, someone said that if it's banned, that means it's important.
Right.
Something in it that
Right.
you need to find. So definitely I agree. Actually asked that question because I know that some authors not necessarily are thankful that their books are on the banned book list, but that makes them feel like that they're doing what needs to be done once it have reached that particular point. So, of course, people are teaching your novels regardless of if they are challenged or not. I was just curious, do you actually teach any of your own works in your classes, or?
I feel weird about that. It feels like, no one has ever explicitly said to me, at any of the universities I've taught at, no one's explicitly said you can't teach your own books, but it just feels like I take that back. One of my professors, when I was at the University of Michigan, one of my professors did teach from his own book, but the book wasn't, it was nonfiction. So maybe it was more like a craft guide. So he wasn't teaching from any of his, from any of his novels. But other than that, I've never had any of my professors teach from their own books. So it feels like something that I shouldn't do. And then too, I think it might be a little awkward. It's easy because I feel like it's easier for me to assess other people's work than my own work. It's easier for me to be clear-eyed about what's working, right? And teach, sort of craft lessons about what you want to do and what's working well from other people's work. Maybe because I think that so much of my process feels, at least in the rough draft and in the first 3-4 drafts, a lot of that work feels very intuitive, so I feel like it would be more difficult for me to teach lessons about craft from my own work because much of the time that I spend creating it, I'm not doing it in an analytical way, I don't do that until I'm writing the 10 revisions or whatever, right, after the sort of early drafts. So I don't know if that makes sense.
I understand that. But is there anything that you would hope that instructors who are perhaps teaching your novels would convey to students, any particular skills or messages or anything?
I don't know. I hope one of the things that I always try to do in all of my work is I try to create complicated characters, right? In the hope that if my characters are complex and complicated enough, they will convince the reader that they're real people, make the reader feel for them and with them, right? And so if anyone is teaching my work, I hope that that's a component of it, because it is something that I try to do in everything that I write. Because I feel like, when I was younger and when I started out, when I first committed to writing, one of the reasons that I did was because I thought, I want to write about the kind of people that I grew up with and the kind of people who are in my neighborhood and the kind of people who are in my community, because I want to sort of show the world that we exist and that we're here, right? And that our lives, are just as, sort of complicated and fraught and lovely as everyone else is, right? In part because I hadn't really encountered much work that was specifically about us, like in this place. And so I wanted to do that in my work. So, so it's been part of my mission, I feel like, in my writing since the very beginning. So I hope that I'm doing it well enough so that when people bring my books into the classroom, that's one of the things that they talk about.
Definitely so. Mission accomplished. Speaking of kind of characterization and development of your stories, I don't know, I'm just curious, have you ever thought about perhaps any of your novels being adapted to the big screen?
I would love for that to happen. I have been eagerly, waiting for that to happen for a long time. And a couple, there are always sort of things cooking behind the scenes, right? So three of my books have been optioned for either, television or film, but as of yet, nothing has moved beyond that first step, right? Because I guess there are so many steps that come afterwards, right? So they have to purchase the rights, and then it has to move deeper into the development process. So as right now, none of that has happened, but I don't know. I'm still hoping that it'll happen one day.
We'll go ahead and say coming soon. Is there a particular novel that you would like to share with the world first on the big screen, or?
I don't know. I mean, I would love to see Salvage the Bones on the big screen. I would love to see Sing Unburied Sing on the big screen, right? I mean, especially because there's that supernatural element to it. That would be, I don't know. I would love that. I think that would be amazing.
Can definitely see more comparisons of Toni Morrison and Beloved and all of that in there, but that would be awesome. So yes, again, coming to the big screen. So I have recently edited a collection of your interviews, Conversations with Jesmyn Ward. It will be coming out in May of 2025, so I'm excited about that. But one of the many ways that I describe you in the book, I say her voice is soft, but her words are firm. And of course, in reading your works, whether it's novels, your memoirs, essays, even your edited collection, of course, I have noticed and clearly in all of your works, you are bold and proud and loving. But I've also noticed that in your interviews, you talk about how sometimes you're a little quiet or shy or less confident. I was just curious what's the difference between writer Jesmyn and everyday Jesmyn? How do you help others who may also have some insecurities overcome those things so they can share their stories as well?
I don't know. I think maybe just sort of talking about my own insecurities and, because I often, when I'm talking about my past, when I'm talking about the kind of student that I was, not necessarily in high school, because the high school I went to was so small, that it was the kind of place where it was tiny. I had 10 people in my graduating class, right? So in a classroom like that, you really can't hide. But when I went to college and then in the years afterwards with graduate school and fellowships, I was very much, and then in my first sort of, I guess, real job that I had, I worked in publishing for 2 years in New York. In my early 20s, I was very quiet, very sort of, I don't know, maybe withdrawn in a way. And I think, that part of the reason that I felt that way was because, there was a lot about, there are a lot of things that are positive about, or that I'm thankful for, right? About my experience sort of growing up here in Mississippi, right? Specifically on the Gulf Coast. And I wrote about those, in Memory Reaped. But then at the same time, there were some things that I lived through that were more difficult, and that I think led to me sort of wanting to flee this place when I graduated from high school. One of the things that I dealt with over and over again was this, I guess, the opinion that some of my classmates and schoolmates in high school had that, that like the colleges that I was accepted to, the scholarships that I received, they were of the opinion that I didn't deserve any of it. And the only reason that I had, got any of those things was because because I'm Black, right? Because of affirmative action, right? And so I think I carried some of that with me, right? I mean, if you hear something like that over and over and over again as a critique, I think it's very difficult to shrug it off every time. And I think that it sort of introduces this element of self-doubt, And then too, like I knew that I was from Mississippi, right? I knew that even though I went to a really good private high school, which it doesn't exist anymore, but it did, and it was a good private school for Mississippi, for the coast, I knew that going to a university like Stanford, which is where I got my undergraduate degree, like my education didn't compare to my classmates, right? Who had gone to, these like famous boarding schools, elite like feeding schools, college prep schools, so the quality of their education was completely different than mine. And so I carried all of that into the classroom with me, and I just thought, I'm not prepared for this, because I don't have the academic background, that a lot of my peers do. And so I carried all of that into the classroom with me, and I just thought, like, I'm probably, and I would think, this is very dark, but I would be like, I'm probably not, I know I'm like the least smart person in this classroom, right? I don't have anything to contribute to this discussion, right? And then the anxiety would build and build and build as I'm like thinking these negative thoughts, and so I just wouldn't say anything. And I'd sit in the it didn't matter where I sat in the classroom. Sometimes I sit in the middle, sometimes I sit in the front, but I still just didn't say anything. So I don't know. I think, like that was my experience, and it took many, many years for me to begin to like work my way out of it. And really a lot of that, of working my way out of it came about when I was doing the Stegner, I got the Stegner Fellowship, right? And again, our classes were so small that it was like I couldn't hide, So I think that was part of it. Also the fact that I got a Stegner Fellowship, right? So it's such a, there's such a large pool of applicants, right? And so, especially in something like that, you're like, they're not letting anybody in here just for the fun of it, right? Like all the people that they're accepting as Stegner Fellows in this program, like everybody deserves to be here. And I would see that in our workshops. I mean, some of the most brilliant writers I've ever studied with, right? I studied with them, in the Stegner program. So anyhow, so I think that being in that environment began to undo, very slowly, like all of that I had struggled with for so many years. And then once I got into the classroom, I think, as an instructor, that changed everything for me too, as I was on the other side of the desk, right? And I was also remembering the kind of student that I was, right? And so I just think so I'm aware, right, that like so many students, they're not just engaging with the work and trying to get a good grade in the class, right? They're bringing so much with them to the classroom, right? And so I just try to be aware of that when I'm in the classroom. And then whenever I get an opportunity like this, I just try to share my story and talk about it, because I think, like if others are aware that even if I'm in this position that I am right now, like that wasn't, once, I was a kid like them. I was, full of self-doubt and, and shy and feeling like I didn't deserve to be in the spaces where I was. And so I think just knowing, that kids like that they're not the only people who are struggling, right, in that way. I think that's helpful too, because it can begin to help them to begin to sort of, I don't know, realize that you may feel that way now, but, right, like that's not the objective truth, and you can work your way out of it.
Definitely. Imposter syndrome is real, but
Right.
we're so glad that you fought through and believe that you deserve to be here, because clearly you do, and we're glad that you're here. I understand that you write a lot about and advocate a great deal for racial and economic injustice, but of course, a good majority of your characters are female, and I can notice womanism in your works. I was just curious, do you identify as a feminist?
I do.
Okay.
I do. And I always have. I feel like it was a little less apparent in my earlier work. But like the family that I come from, I feel like I learned it from, or to think that way, right? To, I guess, be aware of the power and the strength and the resilience and, and the beauty of women from an early age, because I was surrounded by them, like my mom, she consistently made a way out of no way with 4 children for years. And then I looked at my maternal and my paternal grandmothers, right? Both of my grandmothers, had, big families, and they took care of their children. They kept their households together, right? And then I think, look especially at my maternal grandmother and my maternal great grandparents, my maternal great grandmothers, and really many of these women, they were not only were they were these forces who were holding their families together, keeping the family history intact, passing it along to people, passing along life skills, to their children, raising them up in the world, keeping them safe. But they were also, important in the life of the community. My grandmother for years was, before she got older and she became ill, she was heavily invested in our community. She was always doing acts of service, and so I don't know. From a very young age, I feel like I've been surrounded by women who, who were models for me. And so I think that, as I get older, and I'm a mom, and, and I'm, part of my community, and extended family. And so, I don't know, maybe I'm thinking more now about, about the women, in my family and in my community, and thinking more about them and how important they've been in my lives and the lives of so many others. And so maybe now that's why it's I feel like that sort of, these womanist ideas, I feel like maybe now that's why they're finding their way more into my work.
Okay. I know I've read that you're currently working on a YA novel.
Yep.
Will it be set in Mississippi or have similar themes to your other works? Is that something that you could share with us?
Okay, so I don't necessarily know about the themes yet.
Okay.
Because I'm at the very beginning, and I keep struggling with the beginning, in part because I keep rewriting the beginning over and over again, which I need to just, probably jump 3 chapters in and write my way through, and then go back when I'm done, after I reach the end, and then write the beginning. Maybe that would be a better thing to do. But I'm sort of wrestling with it because I'm writing in a completely new genre, right? Which I don't feel very confident in because I've never done before, right? So it feels even though I've read lots of YA, I've read lots of middle grade books, and I know what I love about them. And so, I don't know, it's just trying to, I guess I'm sort of struggling to translate what I love about storytelling for young people into my own work. And I've just never done that before. But it will be set in Mississippi. There's a, the heroine will be, she's a heroine, right? She'll be a girl. I don't know. And yeah, we'll see.
I was worried when you wrote Let Us to Sin that maybe you're like, maybe I've written Mississippi enough and I'll do other settings, but I'm glad to hear that this will be set in Mississippi.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Awesome.
And then I already have an idea for the adult novel that will come after the YA novel, and that one's also set in Mississippi. So no, I'm returning to Mississippi.
Awesome.
Let Us to Sin was just this brief, I guess, foray out into the outside world. But yeah, no, I'm going back.
Do you want to share that idea for the adult novel, or?
It's still very rough, and I haven't pinned it down yet, but okay, so for years I have been one of the, okay, this may sound a little strange, right? But, so I love to read books and watch movies, television shows about sort of apocalyptic end of the world scenarios, right? And years ago, before I started writing Sing and Buried Sing, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to write my version of a sort of post-apocalyptic, right, novel that was just set in the immediate aftermath of a hurricane, right? Where the world has been just completely unmade. And it's surreal, right? So wouldn't it be interesting to write something like that? Then, after that didn't work out, because that's what Sing Unburied Sing originally was, right? And then for those specific characters, I kept trying to put JoJo and Pop in that world, and that just wasn't their story. And so I left that idea alone, and then I found my way to the correct world, the correct story for Pop and for JoJo. But then I don't know why this came up. I mean, my family and I, so the last big hurricane before Katrina to ravage the Gulf Coast was Hurricane Camille in 1969. And me and my mom, I've had conversations about that storm with my dad, with my grandparents, with other people, my aunts and uncles. It just comes up a lot because it was such a definitive moment. And so when I began thinking about 1969, right, and I thought, and what was happening around that time, right, where you have the assassinations, right, of MLK, you have the assassinations of other important political figures, right? You have the civil rights movement burning through Mississippi, right? And then you have this hurricane that unmakes the world. I thought it really must have felt for people who were living through this, specifically in Mississippi, like the world was ending. And so I thought, maybe that's where this next novel should be. So that's the rough idea.
I'm excited for it already.
That's the rough idea for it.
More of a historical text.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I dig it. So I mentioned that I worked on a collection. I'm also working on another monologue where I analyze your works. But of course, there are other edited collections of essays and journals and magazines dedicated to your writing. So someone will one day say, well, not someone, a lot of people will say that they're Jesmyn Ward scholars. How does it make you feel? And then also just fun thing to think about. Of course, in hip hop, Beyonce has the Beehive
Right.
and Nicki has the Barbs. Right. What might your scholars be called?
So, I mean, on one hand, it's flattering, but at the same time, it's it's strange and it's surreal for, especially as I'm sitting here in this environment, right? Like, I grew up here. I remember when I was a kid, when people who were from here would like let their kids actually swim in the Gulf. Like, I don't know, we would spend days at the beach, like swimming in the, the not so great, right, water. Like, so it's surreal, because when I grew up, I mean, this was a dream, but it was a distant dream, right? No one in my family had even gone to a 4-year university, right? Like, my grandmother stopped out of school in the 6th grade, right? My mom, she graduated from high school, she went to some junior college, but she wasn't able to, to finish, right? My dad had dreams of attending art school, but then at the last minute, he had a scholarship and everything, but at the last minute, he decided not to, and that he needed to work to help take care of his family. Like, that's the kind of background, right, that I come from. So to have someone say, they're Jesmyn Ward scholars, and there will be many Jesmyn Ward scholars, it's surreal, and it's amazing, and in a way, because I come from that sort of background, like, it's also a little hard to believe, yeah, so I guess it's just, again, it's like hard for me to articulate, to give you like a good answer to that question, because it just, I don't know, it just makes me feel deeply. And I don't know what they would be called. I'd have to think about that, try to come up with a good answer.
But no, I completely understand. I mentioned that I'm from the Mississippi Delta, and I'm, of course, now trying to make my way and make a name for myself in academia. And my mentor tells me all the time, Kemeshia, you're too humble. Brag on yourself. Let the people know what you're doing. But like you said, when you come from these very humble beginnings, it's a little difficult to accept that, I do have something to share with the world. But definitely you do, and thank you again so much. So I mentioned that my favorite novel, perhaps, is Salvage the Bones, but Esh is definitely my favorite character, although I love Skeet and Big Henry and Ennis from Let Us Descend. But I was really happy when I read Sing, and I saw Esh and Skeet, although very briefly in the novel again, but it made me want more of her story. So I was just curious, do you think that maybe you might ever revisit her story or any of your characters' stories?
I don't know. People have asked me that before. I think maybe out of all of and I feel like more readers have asked me that specifically about her and her family than any of my other characters. So I don't know. I mean, I feel like I can't say that I wouldn't. I've never, as of like now, I've never returned, not in a real way, not for an extended, amount of time, to any of the characters that I've written about before. I think that I would be, I feel like I still love those characters. I still think about them. I still wonder about the kinds of lives that they would lead, like after I leave them, like at the end of the book. So that curiosity about them and that love for them, which I feel like in part motivated the writing of Salvage the Bones, like that still exists. So I could return to them one day, but I realized that I don't have clear ideas about who they are and who they would, like who they are like 10 years after the book or 15 years after the end of the book, in part because when I wrote them into the end of Sing and Buried Sing, I made a mistake, and maybe you've heard this before because I've admitted it a couple of different times, but so I was writing that scene and I wrote it and I was like so happy that I was able to, that they showed up, at the end of Sing and Buried Sing, Esh and Skeeta, and then I did revision after revision after revision after revision. I swear I did like probably 8 revisions, and then I sent it to my editor, and when I sent it to my editor was like, hold on. She said, this book, Singing Bird Sing takes place in, I forget what year it was, I don't know, 2014, 2000, and, I don't know, 15, 16, something like that. She was like, the end of Salvage the Bones took place in, the year that Katrina happened, right? Which is like a decade earlier, right? And she was like, but they're the same age when they're walking. Like when you see them in Sing and Bird Sing, they're the same age that they were at the end of Salvage the Bones. And so it made me realize that in my head, they were stuck. And I didn't even realize it. Like they were stuck at that moment of time at the end of the book. And so I had to go back and like revise that section again and sort of push them forward a little bit in time. And I realized that I hadn't thought it through. I hadn't done that in my head. And I guess the reason is because all of my characters, they're just, where I leave them at the end of the book, like for me, that's where they are in time. I guess unless I decide to devote a whole project to them, right? Then maybe I can do the work of aging them in my head and moving them forward in my head. But for me, they're stuck.
Gotcha. No, I get that. I'm glad to hear that you would be willing to
I would.
write Ash's story, though. And I know that all of your books are your babies, at least that's what I call them, the one that I have. And moms are not supposed to pick a favorite. Do you have a favorite or maybe a favorite character from one of your books?
I don't have a favorite because I love all the characters so much. You know what I'm saying? So as far as like my fiction, my novels, I don't have a favorite novel. I do feel like, and I said this to someone at a book signing, and it surprised me when I said it because I hadn't really thought about it before. But I do feel like I was born to write Men We Reaped. So like, I don't think that it's my favorite. I just think
it's necessary.
Yeah, like it was necessary to tell that story, and it's one of the most important stories that I've ever told. So I do feel that way about that book, but that makes sense. Like when I think about it, right? I mean, because it's about real life people who I love, right? And who I feel like were erased. So that's probably why I feel that way.
That's understandable. I mentioned that a good majority of your characters are women or girls. But interestingly enough, and I think you've talked about this a little bit before, mothers aren't necessarily painted in the best light in a majority of your works. Is there a particular purpose? Is there a message you're trying to convey?
I don't know why so it's only recently that I've begun to think about that, right? In part because I've done interviews or I've had conversations with people and they'll bring that up, right? And I think when I was younger, that wasn't maybe necessarily, that I wasn't writing about the kind of mother that I had, or the kind of, grandmother, not necessarily grandmother, but the kind of mother that I had. I wasn't giving that kind of mother to my characters. I think in part, probably because, it's more interesting to write about, about a problematic mother, I think probably in part because they're maybe more difficult for me to understand, maybe. And so maybe like it's my sort of curiosity and my sort of desire to, because it's so alien to me and to my experience, to understand why a mother wouldn't be a good caregiver. And so I think that was part of what was going on, like in my earlier work. And I think that that was part of the reason why, especially with my most recent novel, with Let Us Descend, that I wanted Annis, who's the young girl, the sort of teenage character. I wanted her to have a sort of strong relationship with her mother. I wanted her mother to really be this sort of nurturing, I don't know, supportive, protective, right? As much as she could be. I wanted her to be that kind of mother for that character, in part because I feel like I hadn't had the opportunity to write that kind of mom into my fiction.
What is one word you would use to describe what your writing is for you, and maybe another word for what you hope it would be for others?
For me, my writing, maybe it's the same word, for me and for readers, because the first word that comes to my mind is restorative, right? Like, writing is restorative for me. It feeds something in me, it nurtures something in me, it releases something in me, it enlarges me as a person, I feel like, right? And allows me to be more empathetic and hopefully more understanding and, I don't know, and more aware of, I don't know, of history and the connections between us. And I don't know, so in all those ways, it is restorative to me. And so, I don't know, I guess that my hope is that it's restorative for readers too. Maybe not in all of the same ways, but I don't know, but I hope that, that they do feel restored after spending time with these characters in the worlds that I write about.